Good morning and welcome to our pre-launch briefing for a new report from the Canadian Climate Institute called Heat Exchange. My name is Sachi Gibson. I'm the Research Director for Mitigation at the Canadian Climate Institute, and I'll be delivering this presentation along with two of my colleagues, Kate Harlan, who's our research lead in the mitigation team and the lead author of this report, and Jason Dion, who's our Senior Research Director. This newest report builds on previous work from the Institute. The economy-wide goal of net zero by 2050 is increasingly the frame for policy conversations in Canada and around the world. And achieving that goal has been a central focus of the mitigation team here at the Institute. In 2021's Canada's Net Zero Future, one of our key findings was that electrification and non-emitting electricity were safe bets, an important and central part of every cost-effective pathway to net zero. In 2022's The Big Switch, we found that Canada's electricity systems needed to get much bigger, cleaner, and smarter to support the electrification of other sectors, including buildings. But we also identified uncertainty around the specifics of building heat decarbonization. In 2023's Heat Pumps Pay Off, we looked more closely at building heat, taking a consumer perspective, and found that heat pumps are already the most cost-effective option for many households across the country. All of this prior work laid groundwork for the research that we are presenting today. In this work, we look beyond the perspective of each individual building to also include the whole energy system, including the costs of building and maintaining electricity and gas infrastructure, and how a transition in building heat could affect other sectors. We're interested in building heat in part because the sector is currently stuck. Greenhouse gas emissions from buildings are still rising. Change is happening towards better efficiency, for example, and greater uptake of heat pumps, but it's not happening fast enough. Building heat is also a complex policy area. There are numerous technologies and energy types involved. Electricity and gas systems and much of buildings policy are in provincial jurisdiction, and provincial energy systems and provincial policy vary significantly across the country. Finally, what happens with building heat is crucial to the success of the entire clean energy transition. Reliable and affordable heat is a necessity for every household and every business in Canada, and energy infrastructure lasts a long time. So decisions made today about investments in electricity and gas systems will be something that we live with and pay for decades to come. But what we've learned from the research that informed this report is that with greater clarity on pathways and the right policy interventions, Canada can bend the curve on emissions from building heat and avoid costly dead-end pathways. So this new research covers three questions. First, we asked what a least cost pathway to net zero means for how buildings are heated in Canada, what patterns are consistent, and what differences can we observe across the country. Second, we wanted to better understand how current policy choices are maintaining the status quo. And finally, what changes policymakers can implement now to better align building heat in Canada with net zero. To answer these questions, we reviewed Canadian and international research in this area and dug into utility filings and regulatory proceedings. We engaged with experts, stakeholders, and government policymakers with knowledge and experience in this area. And we commissioned original modeling from ESMEA, using their NATEM model to identify cost-optimal pathways to net zero. We then tested the robustness of these results across several sensitivity analyses. And these methods led us to the following findings. First, that on a cost-optimal pathway to net zero, electricity will power most space heating in Canada. The details vary from province to province, but the pattern of electrification is consistent across all regions and in all sensitivity scenarios. So here you can see the market share of heat pumps in the dark red increasing from 2020 to 2050 as the economy undergoes a clean energy transition. Electric baseboard heating in the light pink tends to lose some market share to more efficient heat pumps. And in provinces that start out with a lot of gas heating in 2020, we see some uptake of hybrid systems, which pair an electric heat pump with a gas backup furnace that is only used at the coldest times of year. Overall, the amount of space heating that is powered by electricity grows considerably in every province. The energy transition means greater electrification across the economy, not just in buildings. And as we found in the big switch, that requires a significant increase in electricity capacity across the country. A key driver of the extent of electricity capacity expansion is growth in peak demand. So peak demand includes demand from all sectors, including industry and transportation, for example, but building heat is a key contributor. When we look at peak demand from just the building sector, we can see some variation across the country in how the energy transition could affect peak demand from buildings. Specifically in provinces where electricity already provides a large share of building heat, like Manitoba, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Quebec, peak demand from buildings could stay fairly level or even decline due to efficiency gains out to 2050. In provinces that currently use a lot of gas for heat, however, we see the switch to electricity putting upward pressure on peak demand from buildings. Note here that we're just looking at peak demand from buildings. When you add in growth in electricity demand from other sectors, peak demand in all provinces is expected to grow. Mitigating peak demand, not just from buildings, but from all sectors, to reduce the scale and cost of the necessary electricity system build-out will likely emerge as a central challenge facing electric utilities in the energy transition. So various tools to manage peak demand can help. Our modeling finds that in the building sector, energy efficiency can contribute to reducing the scale of the necessary electricity system build-out. Hybrid systems play a role in some contexts to mitigate peaks in winter electricity demand. And other options like heat and energy storage, thermal energy networks, and demand-side management could also play an important role. A cost-optimal clean energy transition will require significant use of all of these options to drive a smarter and more cost-effective build-out of Canada's electricity systems. Alongside this growth in electrification, we see demand for gas decline significantly in the energy transition. This trend shows up in all provinces and across all sensitivity analyses. So here you can see the percent change in gas demand from buildings from 2020 levels in order to meet net zero on a cost-optimal pathway. These numbers include demand from buildings for all kinds of gas, including low-emission gases such as biomethane, which is also known as renewable natural gas or RNG, as well as hydrogen. In our analysis, we do see some limited use of biomethane and hydrogen in the building sector by 2050 on a cost-optimal pathway. But overall, based on the modeling results, building heat is not the most cost-effective use of the available supplies of biomethane and hydrogen. Most of the supply is used to decarbonize other sectors like industry and transportation. By 2050, low-emission gases only replace between 5 and 13% of current gas demand from buildings. We do see an ongoing role for hybrid systems in some contexts, but in the modeling results, even in contexts that see a high uptake of hybrid systems as the economy approaches net zero, gas use still falls significantly. So here we can see in Alberta, which sees some of the highest uptake in hybrid systems in the modeling results. The average amount of gas used in buildings declines as the economy approaches net zero. And this is because hybrid systems will rely primarily on heat pumps as the most efficient heat source, only turning to gas backup at the coldest times. So this combination of growing demand for electricity and falling demand for gas presents challenges for electricity and gas systems and for the regulators that oversee electricity and gas system planning as they navigate the energy transition. For electricity systems, a least cost clean energy transition requires a rapid growth in electricity capacity and carefully managing peak demand. For gas systems, the pattern of declining gas demand on the path to net zero means that continuing expansion of the gas network is risky. Expanding the gas network as the clean energy transition accelerates raises the prospect that fewer and fewer customers must pay the costs of maintaining gas distribution and infrastructure, which could mean higher rates for remaining customers, while gas utilities are still obligated to provide reliable service to their ratepayers. Continuing expansion of the gas network risks stranded assets and higher costs for remaining gas users, missed climate targets, or both. And for the energy regulators who oversee these energy systems, the energy transition changes the context for their decision-making, raising new challenges for their mandate and requiring new approaches to protect the long-term interests of ratepayers. This transition has important policy implications, which Jason will describe in more detail next.
Thanks, Sachi. So let's start by taking stock of where things stand now and where they're headed relative to our findings for cost-effective pathways that Sachi discussed. Existing climate policies have not been enough to reverse the sector's rising emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions from Canada's building sector grew almost 9% between 2005 and 2022. Certainly, climate policies are having an effect and reducing emissions relative to what they would have been otherwise. But population and economic growth are overwhelming their impacts and driving overall emissions increases. Looking forward, analysis from our 440 megatons program finds that the building sector's emissions trajectory is not on track to meet Canada's 2030 target, let alone the 2050 net zero target. Putting the sector on track will require new policies, strengthening existing ones, or some combination. To understand what trajectory Canada's gas networks are on, we comb through regulatory submissions from every province. We find that across the country, provinces with large gas networks have seen significant growth in those networks in the past decade, both in terms of rate base, basically the cost of gas utilities investment in their networks that they will recover from their customers over the coming decades, and their customer numbers. As Sachi explained, our modeling and numerous other studies find that further expansion of gas networks risks raising costs for ratepayers, making climate goals more difficult or costly to achieve, or both. The challenges we present in the two previous slides are in fact connected in complicated ways. Building sector emissions being off track with climate goals is a climate policy problem, and strengthened or additional policies will be necessary to get us on track. But on their own, climate policies are not likely to be enough. Status quo approaches to utility regulation are themselves contributing to the inertia that we showed in the previous two slides. Unless provincial governments intervene to point utility regulators in the right direction, there's a significant risk we end up with continued inertia, even if we get our climate policies on track. Our next three slides will dig deeper into this problem. So let's start with a quick overview of what regulators do and what the energy transition means for them. Though the specifics vary across provinces, by and large, utility regulators are mandated by their governments to ensure gas and electric utilities provide safe and reliable energy at just and reasonable rates. These types of energy rely on network infrastructure, where it only makes sense to have one, rather than competing networks. So in economic terms, they are a natural monopoly. And governments have created utility regulators to ensure these monopoly utilities operate in the public interest. But in almost all cases, these regulators were created before climate change was a societal concern. So it can be unclear how regulators should factor in climate goals. And while some provinces have set net zero goals into law, no province has sufficiently aligned its climate and energy policies with those goals. Because regulators are not in a position to make assumptions about future policy, many regulators have been understandably cautious, absent a mandate clarification or clearer policy. As a result, with only a few exceptions, regulators continue to approve gas network expansion. Protecting the public interest through the energy transition requires strong utility regulation, arguably now more than ever. The infrastructure decisions we're making today will affect both the cost of energy and the cost of meeting climate goals for decades to come. In this transition, gas utilities' incentives do not necessarily align with what is most affordable for ratepayers over the long term. Because gas utilities realize returns primarily on the infrastructure they install rather than the fuel they sell, and because they earn a predetermined rate of return on regulator-approved capital investments, they have a direct economic incentive to pursue continued growth of gas infrastructure and new customers, even if the long-term usage case is uncertain. In a less regulated sector, market signals would reduce the incentive that companies would have to pursue a strategy of continued network expansion in the face of potential demand declines. But gas utilities are partially insulated from these kinds of signals, and enabling legislation that typically limits gas utilities' ability to diversify entrenches commitment to their existing business model. Electric utilities face their own challenges as they assume the mantle of lead actors in the energy transition. The requirement to grow quickly to meet rising demand can clash with an investment approach that's come to prioritize caution in order to pass regulatory approval. But this caution risks driving too slow expansion of the electricity system. The interplay between gas and electricity utilities, which are both governed by the same energy regulator, is also a challenge. After years of operating in parallel in contexts where they provide mostly distinct services, gas and electricity utilities will increasingly overlap in the energy end uses they service, building heat in particular. Faced with this growing overlap, they might compete or collaborate, but either will require close oversight to protect the public interest. In Canada, utility regulation has long operated in a context that could assume slow, steady, and mostly predictable demand growth for electricity and gas. But building heat decarbonization upends this foundational assumption. Some utility regulators are beginning to look seriously at this topic, including the risks continued gas network expansion poses to ratepayers. They understand that the energy transition has important implications for their existing mandate of ensuring safe and reliable energy at just and reasonable rates. The investments they review have multi-decade implications, and protecting current and future ratepayers is core to what they do. But absent direction or expanded policy from provincial governments, most regulators are continuing with business as usual. Governments have not laid out policy that sufficiently connects to their long-term climate goals, where those goals even exist. Regulators can only make decisions related to enacted policies, and currently these rarely extend beyond a decade into the future, compared to the 50-year-plus lifetime of energy infrastructure. With limited scope and authority to integrate the long-term implications of the energy transition into their decision-making, regulators are ending up forced to make decisions that are inconsistent with what's best for ratepayers through the energy transition. Now, importantly, there is every chance of regulators playing the vital and constructive role we need them to. Regulators are already mandated to protect the public interest. They have the expertise and processes to balance competing interests, and they are in the business of making complex decisions in the face of long-term uncertainty. But maintaining their historical role and harnessing their potential through this new context will require action from provincial governments. The previous 3 slides elaborate the way that the 2 policy problems I discussed previously are interconnected. The limits of current climate policy, on the one hand, mean that existing incentives are not strong or consistent enough to drive gas demand down quickly enough. On the other hand, the limitations of climate policy leave regulators inadequately empowered and equipped to oversee the energy transition and the risk it could pose to ratepayers. And these 2 policy problems interact to keep energy systems on the wrong track. Policy action is needed on both fronts, on policy for buildings and on utility regulation. Improved climate policy will drive energy outcomes more in line with climate goals, and improved regulatory oversight will ensure energy systems are ready to meet growing electrification and a shift away from gas. Even though this transition will occur over decades, action is needed now. Delay and continued inertia are risky. If provincial governments do not intervene, they risk higher costs, failure to achieve our climate commitments, or both. And with that, I'll pass it to Kate.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, so as a recap, on a cost-effective path to net zero, electricity powers most space heating in Canada. We see biomethane and hydrogen only replace a small fraction of current gas demand, in part due to supply competition. And hybrid heat systems that use gas as a backup have a potential role in some contexts, but they use little gas in total over the year of any type. The energy transition therefore means contracting gas networks in Canada, but currently gas systems continue to grow. Utility regulators make decisions about infrastructure that will affect ratepayers' costs for decades to come, but they are not currently equipped to address the new challenges and risks that the energy transition poses. Inertia is therefore making the scale of the problem worse. So our recommendations seek to change this trajectory. These are primarily, but not exclusively, directed at provinces, both because utility regulation falls under their jurisdiction, but also because there's so much geographical variation on this topic. Firstly, to unlock action, provincial governments need to provide sufficient policy clarity, not only on climate policy, but also by translating this to energy policy in their local context. And that brings us to our first recommendation shown on this slide. It means that climate targets should be set in legislation, not only out to 2050, but also via interim milestones. But as Jason described, this alone is insufficient. The regulatory system needs further action to change regulatory system legislation. This includes changing the mandate of the regulator to also include consideration of climate targets. Other jurisdictions, such as the UK, have already done this to protect both current and future ratepayers. An energy roadmap can provide a different type of clarity, translating climate goals into energy system implications, including relative roles of the gas and electricity systems. Roadmaps guide the work of utilities, and they give regulators a defensible basis for their decisions. They should be evidence-informed and leverage supporting analysis to avoid those dead ends. Secondly, we seek to reduce the overall risk of stranded gas assets in the energy transition and protect ratepayers. Provincial governments should stop treating gas system expansion as the default option and equip regulators to consider alternatives to achieve this. Provinces should empower their regulator to use tools at their disposal, such as comparing against alternatives when replacing, expanding, and laying new gas pipes. And these can be broadly defined. They can include electrification, pipelines that transport heat, not gas, in a thermal network, and waste heat recovery. There are examples of Canadian regulators already starting to consider energy transition risks, most recently in BC, but it's inconsistent. In some states in the US, however, such as Massachusetts, it's already official standard practice to do this. Provinces also need to review legislation that obligates gas companies to continue with the status quo, whether that's via obligation to serve requirements or other means. And finally, provinces can consider mandates for new builds, particularly new homes. Thirdly, provincial governments should require gas utilities to provide maps of their networks, including the age and condition of each line, to facilitate a managed transition that protects ratepayers. Knowing when and where existing gas pipes need replacement can help with efficient and cost-effective planning across electricity and gas systems. Prudent management of risk can also go further. For example, to limit its own stranded asset risk for its gas system and protect its ratepayers, PG&E, a dual-fuel utility in California, already uses infrastructure mapping to target electrification. And studies in Germany and the Netherlands also show the value of a managed approach and savings for ratepayers. Shifting, meanwhile, to the demand side. All orders of government should strengthen policies to support building electrification, peak management, and energy efficiency. Stable, consumer-focused policies send a clear signal to the market, supporting supply chains as well as consumers. Pairing support for electrification with support for efficiency and demand management tools keeps electricity system costs down and helps to accelerate the switch. As governments and regulators act to limit the extent of the infrastructure liabilities facing ratepayers, provincial decisions must still determine who bears the costs, unrecovered costs of stranded or underused energy infrastructure and how. All orders of government should send equity in policy design and provide targeted support to the most affected. Decreasing gas demand and a contracting consumer base risks burdening remaining consumers with high rates. Absent intervention, those last on the system are likely to be those least able to switch, either for financial reasons or for technical ones. Governments and regulators presiding over energy system changes should anticipate equity impacts and design solutions to address them. Regulators, meanwhile, have an important role to play in cost allocation, while governments can and should centre equity in policy design to target support according to need. This could mean additional support for fuel switching for low-income households. It could mean rate changes or other action. And we'll have more to say on this topic in the coming months. In conclusion, any viable path to net zero for the building sector must ensure that Canadians maintain reliable access to affordable heating. Achieving this will require not just changes in how individual buildings are heated, but also changes to the energy systems more broadly and the regulatory frameworks that govern them. Without action by provincial governments and utility regulators in the transition, ratepayers, shareholders, or governments are at risk of getting stuck with the costs for billions of dollars in underused gas infrastructure. Our recommendations seek to reduce this exposure, thereby protecting consumers also that remain on the network. And provincial action to ensure policy certainty is the missing piece to enable regulators to protect the public interest. Regulators can support the delivery of clean, safe and reliable energy at just and reasonable rates if they are unable to do so. Provincial governments must equip regulators to face the new challenges of the energy transition head on, and we must start turning this ship as soon as possible, given customers will still be paying for new pipes laid today in 2050. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to pass over back to Catherine for Q&A.